Today we're going to talk about the impact of the Ukrainian conflict on the food supply chain. The food supply chain is a major area that the world population relies on for all other economic activity. So if the food supply chain is in trouble or may have a food shortage, then we need to understand the impacts longer term down the supply chain. So we're going to take a look at that in this video. We're going to look at how to analyze the requirements, specifically food, and how it's going to impact the larger supply chain. Look at needs versus wants. What are the global needs versus the global wants? And how does your business fit within those needs and wants? And how is it going to impact how you're able to deliver for the global economy? Look at market availability of food throughout the world and where there are potential weak points and strong points that need to be addressed right now. And then consider potential sources on what you can do, action steps you can take right now to help secure your supply chain in regards to how you use resources for your supply chain. Where do you spend money? Where do you store stuff? And how does it look for your retail market or your market later down the road? So we're going to look at that during this video. At the end, I'm going to share with you a workshop where we go into detail about analyzing requirements for your specific supply chain, but I'll talk more about that at the end. Now, we're going to use an article from CNBC, how a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, could hit supply chains. And what does it mean by that? Russia and Ukraine together produce 29% of the global wheat exports throughout the world. 29% of the global wheat exports from two countries. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. China is the largest recipient of Ukrainian corn. So Ukrainian corn is exporting to another country. A majority or a large portion of Ukrainian corn is going to China. They have a large population, so there's food over there. Okay, and together Russia and Ukraine are a large exporter of metals. Metals have impact not only on the manufacturing of goods, right, and equipment, but also in the manufacturing of fertilizer, and we'll talk about that as well. And where is the impact of a food shortage going to be felt the most? And immediately, maybe the European Union. Long term, throughout the world. So knowing this will have impact on the cost of labor, which ultimately results into and rolls up into the cost of stuff, right? The cost to produce, the cost to acquire raw materials, the cost to transform those raw materials into finished products, the cost of labor to assemble parts into finished goods, the cost of those goods at the end, and then the ability of people to pay for these finished goods, because if these costs are going up throughout the supply chain, even an individual like myself and yourself, if our costs are going up for stuff, then we're going to have to consider the cost of food, and we're going to have to make choices. So you want to think about that. What is the effect down the food chain? So what's going on? Ukraine and Russia are having a conflict, right? Russia invaded Ukraine, and right now our concern is, the atrocities and the war that's going on in that country. However, there's an impact, there's an economy, there's import exports on both sides of those countries. And we need to understand the impact of how those import exports are affecting the greater world. Starting with wheat and corn. Russia and Ukraine account for 29% of the global market for wheat exports. Wheat is a major source of food. China is a big recipient of Ukrainian corn. Okay, Ukraine replaced the U.S. as a corn supplier with Ukraine in 2021. So just last year, China shifted and they get all their corn from Ukraine versus the United States. So where is the demand, supply demand for grains in the world, right? Where is it going to go? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Who are the major exporters of grain and who are the major importers of grain, and think about how that affects your manufacturing footprint. So what does this mean? Well, the U.S. in policy has promised to make up the shortages where there's a shortfall in grains. Where are they getting this shortage? Well, the U.S. has grain reserves. So for the short term, those grain reserves can fill the need for short-term grain needs. Okay, but as the conflict continues, or the impact of the conflict continues to go down the road, then where those shortages are going to be filled, they're going to have to grow the food, which we'll talk about next. So if we want to think about what areas in the economy are wheat impacting, of course food, but more importantly beer. Beer is one of Grain is a major component of beer. And if you want to know more about beer, go ahead and take a look at one of my other videos where I did a short video on green beer during St. Patrick's Day, so you can better understand how the impact of green beer or any beer can be affected by grains. So we want to look at that. That short term can be filled with reserves, but reserves, especially when it comes to food, must be filled or regrown. 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 Okay. And so Ukraine, a major producer of grain, and this is another key piece. Russia is a major producer of fertilizer, a key ingredient to growing food, their ability to grow food, to replace the reserves. And when you look at the statistics, Russia is a huge exporter of fertilizers throughout the world. So the entire world supply chain relies on the fertilizer coming from Russia. All right. So knowing the different components of fertilizer, where do they acquire those components, those elements, and create that fertilizer? What are your alternate sources? Again, we're going to talk about food. So if grain is being used up and it's not being regrown, then it continues to be used up, finding alternate sources of food. From an economic impact, the cost of food, less food, prices go up. When I have to choose between buying food or buying stuff, I'm going to buy food every single time. Every single time I'm going to buy food, right? Okay, so as labor, right? I'm labor, you're labor, we're all labor. We're that human component of the economy used to make stuff. As our need for food and the cost for food goes up, our price to work is going to go up because we must have a compensation for our effort. So you start to see this kind of never-ending cycle of inflation as costs go up, labor costs go up, which have impact further down the supply chain on the production of other stuff. Manufacturing goods, equipment, retail goods, all these different things, those costs start to go up as well. So there's a larger impact down the road. Fertilizer. As I mentioned, Russia is the largest exporter of fertilizer throughout the world, key to growing food. Now we can say fill those short-term needs with reserves, those grain stores, fill those out, but then those grain stores need to be replenished. So in addition to feeding the current world population, there's going to be a demand to fill the reserves back up. So even though we continue to have the ability to fill things or fill, to support the world population with food by current growing needs, we want to build a reserve because, it's nature. Stuff happens. There's, blizzards, there's floods, there's disease, there's insects, there's all these different things that can affect our ability to grow food and how much food we can grow. So fertilizer is very important in being able to grow that food to refill the reserves at the same time supporting the world population. So what's the major impact? What do you need to think about? First, we want to understand needs versus wants. Needs are food. People must have food in their home. People are the labor force for the economy to build stuff, and they are the consumers of retail goods in the retail market. TVs, computers, shirts, clothes, all the different retail goods. That's labor, that's people. And if I have to choose between buying food or buying retail goods, I'm going to pick food, right? And then metals. Metals are used to make fertilizer, which is used to grow food and manufacture products that are used in the economy. So as the cost for labor, the cost for people go up, then the cost of labor goes up, then the cost of manufactured or finished goods goes up, and it continues to go up and go up and go up. And so we need to understand that and start to look at our supply chain, which we're going to talk about some actions here in a few minutes that you can do for your specific supply chain. Now the wants are the retail goods and the entertainment. We don't need retail goods. Certain things we must have, like clothes, but there's other things that we don't have to have. So as the costs go up for food, the cost for labor goes up because of food. They have to buy food. Then the cost of these other manufactured goods are going to start to go as well. So there's going to be, that back and forth, and where people spend their money, they're going to make that choice. And we're going to talk about why is that important for you and your supply chain. Now, from the Vox EU, they're talking about the major impact of the food shortage is on the poor or the middle class because a majority of their net revenue goes to the purchase of food. A majority of the revenue goes to the purchase of food. So if they don't have to, if they have to buy food, they can't buy other things, which our economy is built on consumers buying stuff and moving stuff. We have certain countries that manufacture and certain countries that consume those manufactured goods. But when these consumers start to have to choose between food or stuff, then they're going to choose food, which means these manufacturing companies that are making stuff, there's not going to be such a huge demand for the stuff they're making, right? Which is not going to pay for that labor force that is needing revenue for food over here. So you're going to see this starts to see this long-term impact. Market availability throughout the world. The major exporters of grains are the European Union, Russia, Australia, the Ukraine, and the United States. The major importers of grain are Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia, Algeria, Bangladesh, Brazil, the Philippines. These are major imports. So, the availability is there, but we got to make sure we start to look at if 25% of the exporters is affected by this conflict, 25%, then that needs to be made up somewhere else, right? Those exporters who are currently exporting to these importing countries now have to export more. And when it comes to growing food, it all takes time. And there's a lot more risk in these areas than just manufacturing stuff. All right, these aren't just electrons on a computer screen. These are things that have to be grown in the world to be able to, and that just takes time. And we want to make sure that we're aware of that. We want to make sure we're aware of that and start to think about how that impacts our supply chain. So what do you need to think about right now? So you want to look at your supply chain from raw materials to consumers, all the way down the road. Raw materials to consumers. And raw materials, the cost of those raw materials, let's say metals, okay, not just the cost of those materials, but the labor to extract that stuff out of the ground, right? And then that raw material has to get produced into something. There's labor required to produce that stuff. That cost goes up. And then they have to be moved to another manufacturing to assemble it in finished goods. And those finished goods need to be moved to the consumer, who now has a choice, right? The consumer always has the last choice, the final vote, to buy your stuff, your need, or buy food. So that's where you start to look at that. So you want to look at your supply chain all the way around, and also look at your supplier base and where are their weaknesses. How much do they rely on labor? What is the impact of cost of food in that area? Are they available? Are they taking action now? As well as the impact further down the road. Look at alternate sources, alternate manufacturers, multiple sources. So if one can't work out, then another one can. Where are they located? Start to make those moves now, because this stuff takes time. Not 3 to 6 months, we're talking 12 to 24 months. And if you think about the growing cycle, the amount of reserves that we have, how long those reserves will last, they need to be replenished. And then you have that labor force that needs to be fed so to produce all this other stuff. And then you want to take action to acquire your resources. When it comes to taking action to acquire the resources, think about contract versus ownership. Because I have a contract doesn't mean I own it because it's a piece of paper with somebody. A contract does not mean ownership, it's a piece of paper with somebody. I need to own it. So what's your ability to store? If your costs are here today, the cost of labor is going to go up. That means your costs are going to go up. Can you have the ability to acquire more stuff and store it, so when the costs start to go up, you don't have to buy as much. You already have those resources available, so you can maintain your pricing, remain competitive in the marketplace. So these are things you want to think about when you're analyzing your supply chain. You may not be a food producer, but we're all food consumers. And the cost of food impacts our ability to do things. The cost of labor, the ability to produce, the ability to sell, the ability to buy, all these things are affected by the cost of food. So food is one of those keystone areas in the global economy that must be addressed all the time. And fortunately, corn has not been transformed into a source of fuel. We do rely on fossil fuels, and that's another discussion for a different day. But right now, if we had to choose between using corn to drive ships and trucks and all those other things, or feeding population, it's not really a tough choice. You feed people, but then your other stuff can't move, right? So that's another conversation for a different day. So analyzing your requirements and looking down your supply chain, that's something that we teach at Supply Chain Management University. We have a workshop called Analyzing Requirements, and we look at 3 areas: how to look at your stakeholders to align their needs and wants with the organizational plans, look at the feasibility of those requirements to the organization, and then evaluate potential sources. This isn't sourcing itself, it's looking at, well, where do I buy this stuff? What areas do I need to look at? Insourcing, outsourcing, imports versus exports, global sources versus in-country sources. We're going to look at all these things in this particular workshop. Now, if you're interested in looking at this workshop and joining us, go ahead and go to supplychainmanagement.university. That's where we're going to go through. It's called Analyzing Sourcing, or Analyze Sourcing Requirements. It's one of the essential skills workshops for supply chain professionals that we are putting on, and you can go ahead and join us for that workshop and learn more about our program. When you go through that workshop, you're going to learn how to assess the needs of stakeholders to separate actual requirements from nice to haves, how to evaluate stakeholders' needs to see how the requirements align with the organizational objectives, evaluate the feasibility of those requirements within the constraints of your organization. As I mentioned, storage. Your constraints could be capital, to buy things ahead of time before you can sell them, right? As well as storage, if you have to buy them ahead of time, where are you going to put them? And there's cost for storage as well. So looking within those constraints, what can you do? And your market. If your market is a consumer market that buys stuff and they have to choose between buying food or buying your stuff, most likely they're going to choose food over your stuff. So you may want to anticipate that. And where can you go for that? Well, we'll talk about that during the workshop. And analyze your potential sources. Where are you going to find the stuff you need for this? This is all in our Supply Chain Professional program, which you can get access to for a single workshop, or join our monthly membership, where every month we do another workshop and we take those fundamentals and we apply them to current events, so you can think about how they apply to your organization. Okay, go to supplychainmanagement.university to learn more about this program, and I look forward to seeing you soon.